Welcome to Anunnaki Sanctuary's channel. Tonight we wander through a city of baked clay and starlight, where the air tastes faintly of river mud and smoke, and where the Anunnaki drift at the edges of old stories like silhouettes on a wall you cannot quite touch. You can almost hear a reed stylus scratching on a damp tablet. That soft, patient sound of a civilization trying to hold time still. Some parts of what you will hear are widely accepted history, the kind most historians agree that archaeology supports. Some parts are interpretation, because historians debate meanings when the words are ancient and the contexts are lost. And some parts are calm, cinematic, what-if imagination. Because the mind likes to walk into the fog as long as we keep the cliff edge clearly marked. We are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop a comment with your location and your local time, so this quiet story can stretch around the world. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in a place that most historians agree is not one city, but many cities, layered like warm bread, each rebuild pressed into the one below. The land is flat enough that the horizon feels like a promise, and the rivers do most of the talking. Archaeology suggests that early Sumerian communities organized themselves around irrigation, canals, and the careful scheduling of labor. That is the solid ground. The evidence we do have points to people counting grain, tracking herds, marking deliveries, and creating systems that would not win any poetry contest but would absolutely keep a city alive. And then, once the counting begins, the stories begin too, because humans cannot help themselves. You watch a scribe kneel beside a low table, a lump of clay waiting like a small moon in his palm. He presses the reed stylus in, again and again, making wedge-shaped marks. At first, it is all practical. This many jars, that many sheep, a list of names, a date tied to a festival. But a careful reading might suggest that something else happens when writing appears. Not magic, not instant enlightenment, just a subtle shift. When a city can store memory outside the body, memory stops being only a feeling and becomes a thing. And once memory becomes a thing, power can pick it up, turn it over, and decide how to use it. Most historians agree that the earliest writing in Mesopotamia served administration and economics, not epic storytelling. That is important, because it means the first tablets are not dramatic. They are the ancient equivalent of a spreadsheet. And if you have ever stared at a spreadsheet at 2A, you know that is its own kind of haunting. Now, in the quiet gap between the practical tablets and the later mythic ones, the Anunnaki appear in the imagination like candlelight catching on a knife edge. In many later texts, the Anunnaki are divine figures, a group of gods associated in different ways with authority, judgment, and the underworld. That is broadly accepted in the sense that the term exists in sources and is used in religious literature. But what the Anunnaki precisely are, or how their role shifts from one place and time to another, is where interpretation begins to stir. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were always a fixed pantheon with a consistent job description, or whether the word functioned more like a flexible label that scribes and priests used differently across centuries. If you let that uncertainty settle, it becomes oddly soothing. It means the ancient world is not a locked box. It is a room with the lights low, and you can move slowly, touch the outlines, and accept that some furniture remains in shadow. You drift through a temple courtyard in your mind. The bricks are sun-warmed. Even at night they hold the day's heat like a secret. The smell is a blend of dust, date palms, and the faint tang of beer. Because, yes, people are still people, and most civilizations discover the joy of fermented grain early. A priest passes, humming a tune you cannot place. Somewhere behind a wall, an animal complains about being awake. And honestly, same. Archaeology suggests that temples in early Mesopotamian cities were not only religious spaces, but economic hubs, with storerooms, labor management, and large institutional roles. This is one of those mainstream anchors that quietly explains a lot. If temples handle resources, and writing tracts resources, then scribes become the nerve endings of the city. And if scribes shape what gets recorded, then scribes also shape what gets remembered. One interpretation is that many divine stories are also political stories in ceremonial clothing. Not fake stories, not lies, just narratives that carry social meaning. A god-granting kingship might reflect a human institution trying to present itself as natural and unquestionable. A divine council might mirror a human council, idealized, stabilized, and set up in the sky where nobody can vote it out. And now, gently, what if some of the later Anunnaki references are echoes of older power structures, remembered through ritual even when the original context faded? What if the gods are not only beings, but metaphors for the way authority feels when you are a farmer, staring up at a temple platform that seems to touch the stars? What if the stories are pointing at something else? You step into a scribal house, a place where apprentices learn to press clay and memorize lists. It smells like wet earth and patience. The teacher is not kind, but not cruel either. He is simply tired. He has corrected the same sign 1,000 times. His eyes have the same look you see in modern people trying to explain passwords to relatives. Here is another mainstream fact that keeps you grounded, sir. Scribes trained through repetition, copying standard lists, signs, and model texts. The evidence we do have points to a highly structured educational system for writing. And in that system, mythic texts eventually become part of the curriculum, copied, preserved, and carried forward. So when you think of Anunnaki stories, you are not imagining a campfire tale drifting casually through the night. You are imagining something curated, written, recopied, and stored. Sometimes by institutions that had reasons to keep certain narratives alive. A more cautious explanation could be that the Anunnaki show up in texts not because someone witnessed something extraordinary, but because religious language evolves, borrows, and reuses older terms in new contexts. Words migrate, goods migrate. The same name can wear different clothes in different centuries. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were not symbolic at all, but literal outsiders, visitors, or advanced beings remembered imperfectly in myth. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has a certain grip on the modern imagination. It gives people a clean answer to a messy question. It makes the unknown feel like a solved riddle. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less of a claim and more of a mood. A cinematic lens you can hold up for a moment and then set back down. So you hold it up briefly. In your mind, the night sky over the city feels unusually close. The stars look like punctures in a dark cloth. The ziggurat steps, still not quite the towering form you see in later eras, seem to rise toward that cloth as if someone tried to stitch earth to heaven. You imagine a council not of monsters, not of invaders, but of beings who feel distant, orderly, almost bureaucratic, divine. Yes, but also strangely administrative, like cosmic accountants who never smile in meetings. And then you set the lens down again, because the solid ground matters. The solid ground is the clay, the canals, the labor, and the writing. You wander to the edge of the city where water runs in a channel, guided by human hands. You hear frogs and insects. You see a worker in the dark, checking a gate, making sure the flow is correct, because tomorrow's crops depend on tonight's water. Archaeology suggests that this kind of management was essential and constant. It is not glamorous, but it is the true heartbeat. One interpretation is that gods tied to water, wisdom, and creation reflect the centrality of water to survival. When the river is life, the god of water becomes the god of everything. When the canals fail, your theology becomes very practical, very quickly. Now your mind returns to the scribal house. The teacher sets a fresh tablet in front of you. You're told to write a list of signs, then a list of professions, then a list of offerings. It is tedious in the way that slowly builds a civilization. And somewhere in that sequence, you copy a line that mentions gods as if their names belong on the same page as barley and sheep. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can confirm that texts exist, that words like Anunnaki appear, that temples and scribes and kings shaped what was recorded. We cannot confirm a single, fixed meaning behind every mention. We cannot confirm a single origin story for the term that satisfies every scholar. We cannot confirm whether these gods are best understood as a stable group, a shifting category, or a poetic label that later readers turned into a caste list. Historians still argue whether the earliest kernels of these divine groupings reflect local cult traditions that merged over time, or whether they were conceptual frameworks imposed by later scribal schools to organize a complex religious world. That debate is not a problem. It is a lullaby. It tells you that you do not need to solve everything to appreciate it. So you slow your steps. The air cools. The clay underfoot holds the last warmth of the day. You hear that reed stylus again, a soft tapping, a tiny percussion section for the oldest city music. You think about what writing does. It freezes a moment. It turns breath into a mark. It lets a story outlive the throat that spoke it. And what if the first writing, meant for counting, accidentally opened a doorway for gods to become portable? A god no longer needed to live only in ritual and voice. A god could live in a tablet, in a shelf, in a storeroom, in a library, waiting quietly to be read again. That is not proof. That is a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Writing did not create gods, but it may have changed how gods traveled through time. It might support the idea that religious concepts became more standardized as texts circulated and education systems repeated them. This is suggestive, not conclusive. You take one last look at the city. Not a postcard city, not a neat museum display, but a living place where people wake early, haul baskets, argue about deliveries, and sometimes look up at the sky and feel small. In that feeling of smallness, a name like Anunnaki can bloom. Not because you saw something land, but because you needed a language for forces larger than yourself. And with that, you let the clay tablet rest. You let the stylus stop tapping. You let the night air settle, as if the city itself is exhaling. You walk into a quieter kind of document now. One that feels less like a receipt and more like a stage prop with a serious face. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamia produced king lists that were not just records, but arguments about a legitimacy. A line of names can be a ladder. A ladder can be a claim. And here, in the soft lamp glow of scribal culture, you find one of the most famous examples. A list that tries to stitch together rulers, cities, and time itself into something orderly. Archaeology suggests that real dynasties did exist in the cities named, and inscriptions elsewhere confirm some kings as historical people. That is the solid ground beneath your feet. But the list also contains reigns that stretch into lengths that feel more like mythology than administration. This is where interpretation begins to hover, like dust in a beam of light. One interpretation is that those extremely long reigns are not meant to be taken as literal years on a calendar, but as symbolic statements about a distant, idealized past. Numbers can be poetry in bureaucratic clothing. They can also be a way to emphasize importance. To say, this era was bigger than normal life, without needing to explain how. And what if those impossible spans are like candle shadows on the wall, hinting at a story that is not about exact time, but about the feeling of time, as if the world once moved slower under a different sky. You pause beside a low table where a scribe smooths clay with wet fingers. He is careful, because a tablet is not just a page. It is weight. It is something you can drop on your toe, and then you will learn an ancient lesson about gravity. He begins to write the names, city by city, rule by rule, as if he is building a bridge across centuries. Now, in the popular imagination, this is often where people try to invite the Anunnaki to stand in the doorway, arms folded, looking smug, like cosmic landlords collecting rent. But we are going to keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The evidence we do have points to the list as a product of later scribal compilation, reflecting political needs and literary tradition. It is not a live feed from the dawn of time. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of such lists was historical memory, political propaganda, religious worldview, or some blend that refuses to be separated cleanly. This debate matters because it keeps you from treating the text like a simple window. It is more like a painted window. You can see through it, but you also see what someone wanted you to see. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian kingship was deeply tied to divine favor. Kings presented themselves as chosen, supported or guided by gods. That is a mainstream anchor. It shows up in inscriptions, temple building accounts, and royal titles. Even when a king was clearly a human with human problems, he still wanted a cosmic endorsement. Who would not? If you're going to demand taxes, it helps to say the universe is on your side. One interpretation is that the list's talk of kingship descending from heaven is not a literal meteor delivery, but a ceremonial way of framing authority as sacred and universal. It's possible that the phrase functioned like a stamp of legitimacy. Kingship belongs to the order of things, not to whoever is loudest with a spear today. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply how political language worked, turning human institutions into timeless ones. And now the cinematic what-if slips in, like a cat that knows it is not supposed to be on the table. What if the scribes themselves felt a genuine awe about the deep past? What if, as they copied names, they sensed the weight of lost cities, buried canals, forgotten floods, and they needed a vocabulary big enough for that feeling? Maybe the Anunnaki, in some contexts, became part of that vocabulary, not proof of visitors, but a mythic way of naming the vastness between then and now. You move closer to the numbers. Some reigns are so long they seem to belong to stone, not flesh. Your sleepy brain tries to picture a king ruling for centuries, and immediately gets tired, because honestly, ruling for one day seems exhausting. The scribe writes calmly anyway, because for him the task is not to imagine it literally, but to preserve the tradition. The evidence we do have points to number symbolism in ancient cultures, and to the reality that scribes worked with mathematical systems that can produce large figures in a way that feels less absurd inside their framework. That is not an excuse, it is context. It suggests that the long reigns can be read as part of a literary and ideological pattern rather than a forensic report. A fringe idea proposes that these extreme reigns are evidence of non-human rulers or genetically altered humans, sometimes linked by modern storytellers to the Anunnaki. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it keeps showing up because it is dramatic, and drama sells. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a kind of mood lighting. It does not change the furniture in the room, but it changes how the shadows fall. So you let the mood lighting flicker, just for a breath. In your imagination, the city's rooftops blur into a haze, and a different kind of dawn hangs over the plain. The rivers shine like metal. Figures stand on a high platform, not necessarily aliens, not necessarily gods, just distant silhouettes that your mind cannot resolve. The tablet in your hand feels like a relay baton passed through time. What if the text is pointing at something else? What if the exaggeration is not deception, but reverence? Then you return to solid ground again, because the solid ground is wide and steady. Archaeology suggests that cities rose and fell, that political controls shifted between centers like Kish, Uruk, Ur, and others across different periods. The list's organization by city can reflect a worldview where kingship is a traveling office, moving to where power currently lives. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian history is not one straight line, but a braided river of competing city-states. One interpretation is that the king list tries to tame that braid. It takes chaotic reality and arranges it into a single sequence, making the past feel orderly. It's possible that this is not meant to trick anyone, but to comfort them. Humans like the idea that history has a spine. You hear laughter somewhere nearby. Two apprentices are whispering as they work, trying not to be caught. One of them has a smudge of clay on his cheek like an accidental war paint stripe. He looks very serious about it, which makes it funnier. A third apprentice is so focused on copying that his tongue sticks out slightly. You have to admire the dedication or the inability to multitask. Either way, relatable. Now you notice something else. The list does not only claim enormous reigns, it also includes abrupt endings, shifts, and the sense that catastrophe and change are part of the rhythm. That is another mainstream anchor. Mesopotamian cities endured environmental challenges, warfare, and political upheaval. The evidence we do have points to cycles of stability and disruption. A careful reading might suggest that the list's structure is a response to that instability. When life is uncertain, a text that says, "Kingship continues, even if cities fall," can feel like a charm against chaos. And in that charm, the divine language grows. Gods are the promise that order exists, even when you cannot see it. Historians still argue whether we should read the king list primarily as a historical source to be mined cautiously, or as a literary artifact that tells us more about the period of its compilation than about the deep past it describes. Scholars continue to debate how much of it preserves early memory and how much is reshaped narrative. There's no full consensus, and that is okay. The fog is part of the landscape. You hold the tablet in both hands. It is cool now, losing the warmth of the scribe's palms. The marks are crisp, the names lined up like footsteps in wet sand. You imagine those footsteps continuing into a distance you cannot walk, and you remember the safety rule for your mind tonight. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. So, what can you keep? You can keep the idea that the king list reflects a culture deeply concerned with legitimacy and continuity. You can keep the idea that enormous reigns signal mythology, symbolism, or ideological emphasis, not necessarily biology. You can keep the idea that divine language is a political and religious instrument as much as a spiritual expression. And what can you let float lightly without grabbing it too tightly? You can let float the possibility that words like Anunnaki, used in later traditions, became part of how people framed authority that felt larger than human scale. You can let float the cinematic thought that the deep past was experienced as a different kind of world. Not because it was literally ruled by outsiders, but because the distance itself makes it feel unreal. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. The tablet does not solve the puzzle. It holds the puzzle carefully, like a bowl holding water without spilling. Even when your hands tremble, you set it down gently. The lamp flame shivers once, as if nodding, and you step onward, calm, curious, and unhurried. You're out on the plain where the wind has nothing to bump into except your thoughts. A city rises ahead, but it feels older than walls, older than street plans, older even than the confidence humans get when they decide a place will be permanent. Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamia saw some of the earliest large-scale urban communities, and archaeology suggests that Eridu is among the deepest and most symbolically important sites in that story. The evidence we do have points to long occupation, multiple rebuilding phases, and a powerful relationship between settlement and water. You walk as if you can feel that relationship under your soles. The ground is firm in some places, powdery in others, with salt crusts that crackle softly. The air smells faintly mineral, like stone warmed by sun and then cooled too fast. You can almost taste the river, even when you cannot see it. Somewhere, a bird calls as if it is reviewing your pace and finding it inadequate. Eridu in the imagination is often painted as the first city, the original seed, the place where civilization stands up straight and brushes the dust off its knees. A more cautious explanation could be that first is a complicated word. Archaeology suggests that multiple communities developed complex features over time, and what we call a first can depend on the evidence we have and the definitions we choose. Still, even with that caution, Eridu carries a gravity. It sits in the mind like a quiet stone. Now you step into the temple area, so what remains of it? The bricks are not shouting, they are whispering. You feel the outline of platforms, the logic of rebuilding, a sacred space renewed again and again, each layer saying, "Keep going, keep the place alive." Most historians agree that temples were central to city identity, and that religious practice and civic organization were braided tightly together. That is a mainstream ground, steady as packed earth. One interpretation is that stories attached to Eridu and its gods reflect not only theology, but lived reality. Water is not a background detail here. It is the main character. In a landscape where rainfall is scarce, where canals must be maintained, where salinity can creep into fields like an unwanted guest, water becomes sacred by necessity. A careful reading might suggest that the myths are memory aids for survival, wrapped in beauty so people will repeat them. And now, the Anunnaki step into the mist, not as proof, not as fact, but as a mood that many later readers bring with them. In later traditions, Eridu is linked with the god Enki, a figure associated with fresh water, wisdom, craft, and sometimes secret knowledge. The evidence we do have points to Enki as a major deity in Mesopotamian religion, with deep roots and evolving roles. Where the Anunnaki fit into this depends on the text and the time, which is exactly why we keep our verbs soft. Historians still argue whether the divine groupings in Mesopotamian religion represent stable categories from the earliest periods, or whether they are later theological arrangements that retroactively organize older local cults. Scholars continue to debate how much continuity to assume. There's no full consensus, and your mind can rest in that. You walk along what might once have been a canal edge. The water is not here now, at least not in your imagination's weather report. But you can picture it. Slow, brown-green, carrying reeds, insects skating on the surface like tiny dancers. A fisherman stands nearby with a net, and the net is patched so many times it looks like it has its own biography. He nods at you with the tired friendliness of someone who has already been awake for 5 hours. Archaeology suggests that early Mesopotamian communities relied on fishing, herding, and agriculture, with shifting patterns as environments changed. The evidence we do have points to wetlands, marsh resources, and the gradual transformation of landscapes through human engineering. This matters because it gives you a real-world engine for myth. When environments shift, stories shift too. One interpretation is that some creation traditions may preserve echoes of changing shorelines, receding wetlands, and the uneasy boundary between land and water. It's possible that what sounds like cosmic drama is also a community describing the world it sees. Water everywhere, then water controlled, then water threatening again. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the gods are the human attempt to negotiate with forces that do not negotiate back? Here is where the cinematic what if arrives gently, like fog rolling across water at dawn. What if an ancient storyteller, standing on a temple platform, looked out at a marsh that seemed infinite and felt the world was young and unfinished? What if the Anunnaki, in later imagination, became shorthand for that feeling, powers older than cities, powers you cannot make sign a contract, not alien engineers with blueprints, but the vastness itself, given names so you can speak to it without trembling? A fringe idea proposes that sites like Eridu contain traces of a lost high civilization or outside influence, sometimes linked in pop culture to the Anunnaki. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because it turns slow human development into a sudden spark. It makes history feel like a plot twist. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can enjoy the suspense without turning it into a verdict. So you let yourself enjoy the suspense. In your mind, the temple platform becomes a vantage point, not just over canals, but over time. You imagine lights moving on the horizon, not necessarily ships, not necessarily machines, just distant glimmers that your sleepy brain turns into questions. The air is cool. The reeds hiss softly. You feel that familiar pull to say, it must have been something extraordinary. Then you breathe and return to what's broadly accepted. Most historians agree that complex societies can arise through incremental change, innovation, and adaptation, especially in regions where managing resources demands coordination. Archaeology suggests that the rise of cities in Mesopotamia involved trade networks, craft specialization, and institutional organization. The evidence we do have points to humans doing what humans do best, making systems, making tools, making problems, and then making more tools to fix them. You step into a small shrine space. You imagine an offering bowl, a bit of bread, maybe a jug of beer. Yes, beer again. Ancient people loved it. And honestly, if you had to carry water from a canal all day, you would probably become a fan too. A priest murmurs words that feel like both prayer and policy. He is asking for protection, but he is also reinforcing the city's shared story about why it exists. One interpretation is that religion in early cities provided social glue, a way to coordinate labor and identity. That does not reduce it. It explains its power. When 1,000 people need to maintain canals and harvest at the right time, Shared ritual can synchronize them like a heartbeat. Now think about the phrase, first city, again. A careful reading might suggest it is less a scientific label and more a mythic one, a way for later people to place origins somewhere meaningful. Origins are always chosen. They are never just found. Eridu, in that sense, becomes a symbol as much as a site. Historians still argue whether Eridu deserves the title of first city in a strict archaeological sense, or whether that title is better understood as a cultural memory expressed through later tradition. And because historians still argue whether labels like first city are even useful across different definitions of urbanism. You can feel the debate itself like a soft wind, never harsh, just persistent. You walk out toward the edge of where water once pooled. You kneel and scoop a handful of damp earth in your imagination. It feels cool, grainy, alive with tiny bits of plant matter. You let it crumble back down. The sound is small, but it carries. Here is a new development for your mind. A small turn of the kaleidoscope. Consider that the Anunnaki, in some readings, are not the focus of the earliest city stories at all, but a later overlay, a term that becomes prominent in certain contexts. That raises an interesting possibility. What if modern listeners, hungry for a single mysterious cast of characters, tend to pull the Anunnaki into every shadow, even when ancient texts are more diverse and less tidy? What if the real mystery is not that the ancients hid one secret, but that they held many overlapping narratives, each with its own local emphasis? That is not a scolding. It is a gentle reminder that ancient religion is a landscape, not a single road. Different cities emphasize different gods. Different periods reshaped old names. The evidence we do have points to a living tradition, not a frozen script. So you let the city be complex. You let Eridu be both a place and a symbol. You let the water be both resource and metaphor. You let the Anunnaki remain a debated interpretive thread rather than a confirmed answer. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And as the wind moves across the plain, you feel the calm of not forcing the puzzle to snap into a single shape. You just walk. You listen. You let the reeds whisper. You let the ancient bricks keep their quiet. You step into a myth that moves like a slow dream, the kind where every door's heavy and every hallway seems to remember your footsteps. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths were performed, copied, and reshaped across generations, and archaeology suggests that temple culture and scribal education helped preserve these narratives. The evidence we do have points to a world where stories were not just entertainment, but a way to think with the whole body. Tonight, your mind drifts into The Descent of Inanna, a story that is widely known in later versions and echoes older themes about power, loss, and return. What's broadly accepted is that Inanna, or her related forms across time, is a major figure associated with love, fertility, and war. And that descent stories are a common ancient pattern for exploring boundaries between life and death. That is solid ground. The mist begins when people ask what the descent is really about. You stand at the edge of a great gate, and the air changes. It smells colder here, like stone that never sees the sun. A guard watches you with the weary expression of someone who has checked the same tickets for eternity. You almost want to say, "Sorry to bother you," but you are not sure if sarcasm works on gatekeepers of the underworld. One interpretation is that the descent myth reflects ritual cycles, seasonal change, or social structures, with the underworld serving as a metaphor for periods of scarcity and return. A careful reading might suggest it also stages a drama of authority. What happens when a powerful figure chooses to enter a domain where power is measured differently? The story can be read as a lesson in humility or in transformation, or in the frightening truth that no one is exempt from limits. Historians still argue whether the descent narrative should be read primarily as a ritual text connected to temple practice, as a political allegory about kingship and legitimacy, or as psychological literature that explores grief and identity. There's no full consensus, and the lack of a single answer makes the story feel alive, like a candle flame that never holds the same shape for long. You pass through the first gate. Something is taken from you, as if the underworld collects symbols the way a city collects taxes. It is not gory, not violent, just quietly stripping, like a winter wind removing leaves. The sound of your steps becomes more noticeable. The silence is thick enough to lean on. Most historians agree that ancient societies used myth to negotiate fear and meaning, and that the underworld in Mesopotamian thought was not a place of moral reward and punishment in the later sense, but a shadowy destination tied to death's inevitability. The evidence we do have points to funerary practices, grave goods, and lament traditions that show people mourning, honoring, and trying to maintain bonds across the boundary. One interpretation is that the underworld is not a courtroom, but a landscape of separation. If you read the descent this way, it becomes less about divine adventure and more about a universal experience. You cannot take everything with you. Status changes at the threshold. Identity changes. The story makes that truth bearable by giving it a narrative shape. Now, where do the Anunnaki enter? In some later contexts, the Anunnaki are associated with underworld powers or a divine assembly. The evidence we do have points to the term being used in different ways across texts and periods, which is why we tread softly. It's possible that, for some scribes, naming an underworld council gave structure to the invisible. A careful reading might suggest that an assembly of divine figures functions like a mirror of human institutions, councils, judges, elders, decision-makers. It is how a society imagines order continuing even beyond death. And then the cinematic what-if slides in, gentle as dust falling through lamplight. What if the descent is pointing at something else? What if, behind the ritual and metaphor, the story preserves a feeling of encountering the unknown, the kind you get when you walk into a cavern and your torchlight only reaches so far? Not proof of literal beings, but the sense that reality has levels you cannot map. A fringe idea proposes that descent stories are coded accounts of contact with non-human realms or otherworldly entities, sometimes linked by modern rumor to the Anunnaki as literal rulers of an underground domain. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals to the part of the mind that loves hidden doors. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can add atmosphere without hijacking the story, so you let it add atmosphere. You imagine the gates as more than stone. You imagine them as thresholds in consciousness, where each step down makes the air slightly different, the sound slightly muted, the colors slightly drained. You feel watched, not by monsters, but by attention itself, as if the universe is noticing you for the first time. Then you return to solid ground. Most historians agree that Inanna's mythology reflects a complex deity with multiple roles, and that the descent story, in any reading, dramatizes transition. Archaeology suggests that ritual lamentations and temple festivals helped communities process change, loss, and hope. The evidence we do have points to performance, repetition, and the way shared narrative can soothe collective nerves. You reach another gate, another symbol is removed. By now you are beginning to understand the rhythm. The underworld is not rushing. It is not trying to scare you. It is simply doing what it does. The calmest horror, if you want to call it that, is not threat. It is inevitability. And because we are sleep-friendly here, we will call it gravity. The story is teaching gravity. One interpretation is that the descent is about what power looks like when it is stripped of costume. In the world above, Inanna is radiant, feared, adored. Below, she must negotiate like anyone else. This might support the idea that Mesopotamian listeners understood status as both real and fragile. It raises the possibility that myth offered a safe space to contemplate the unthinkable, that even the mighty must face limits. Historians still argue whether the narrative's details reflect earlier Sumerian versions, later editorial reshaping, or a mix. And they debate how much the story's structure was designed for recitation, teaching, or ritual. Scholars continue to debate what audience it served most: priests, scribes, or a broader public listening in communal settings. Here is a new development to keep your mind from getting too cozy. Consider the way the story treats knowledge. Each gate is not only a loss, but a narrowing of identity. You become simpler. You become closer to the core. A careful reading might suggest that ancient myths sometimes function like guided meditation, forcing the listener to imagine shedding layers. That does not mean the scribes intended mindfulness apps, but it does mean the story can still work that way on your nervous system. You're invited to descend slowly, breathe slowly, and accept that you cannot control every step. You reach the deepest point. The air is still. The silence is not empty. It is full, like a jar packed with ash. You do not need to see anything graphic. The power of the scene is in what is withheld. The underworld does not show you a spectacle. It shows you a boundary. In some versions and interpretations, there is a council, judges, or divine authorities. If the Anunnaki are invoked in that atmosphere, they become less like characters with biographies and more like a symbol of cosmic administration. Yes, that phrase sounds unromantic. Cosmic administration, the universe filing paperwork. But honestly, it explains a lot. Even now, if you want to get something done, you end up in a waiting room. The gods simply had better architecture. A more cautious explanation could be that these assemblies reflect the social reality of councils and courts in the human world. They are narrative tools. They make decision-making visible. They show that even in myth, outcomes are negotiated, argued, weighed. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the descent is also a map of how communities handle trauma? You enter. You lose what you thought defined you. You face the unspeakable, and then, somehow, you return with a changed understanding. Not a miracle. A process. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it is a gentle way to let the story rest in your mind, not as proof of anything strange, but as a mirror that still reflects. You begin to rise, not with a triumphant fanfare, but with the soft sound of breath returning. The air warms by degrees. The gates open one by one. Symbols return, but they do not fit exactly the same way. Once you have been stripped, you cannot wear identity with the same innocence. Most historians agree that myths endure because they can be reread across time, and archaeology suggests that scribal schools preserved them through copying and teaching. The evidence we do have points to a tradition that valued these narratives for their ability to hold complexity. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki's underworld association in some texts represents an early theological feature or later emphasis, and they debate how strongly we should connect specific divine groups to specific myth scenes. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You step back into the night air of the living world, and it feels almost loud. A distant dog barks. Someone laughs. A clay jar clinks. You exhale. The descent stays with you, not as a solved riddle, but as a slow, steady story that teaches your mind to loosen its grip. You move into a different kind of mystery now. One that feels less like a journey and more like a cabinet full of labeled drawers. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian culture treated civilization as something you could name, categorize, and ritualize. And archaeology suggests that temple institutions managed not only goods, but also ideas, training, and prestige. The evidence we do have points to a world where power often arrived wearing the mask of organization. In that world, you meet the concept of the me, often described as the powers, offices, or attributes that make a society function. What's broadly accepted is that texts describe these me as belonging to the divine realm and being transferred, guarded, or displayed in stories. The details vary across versions and languages, and that is where interpretation takes its first careful steps. You stand in a temple storeroom that smells like clay and cedar. Jars line the walls. Seals hang on cords. A scribe checks a list and mutters under his breath. The ancient equivalent of, "This inventory is going to ruin my evening." You can almost hear the tiny click of a cylinder seal rolling across wet clay, leaving behind a miniature scene like a picture you can feel with your fingertips. Archaeology suggests that administrative sealing was widespread in Mesopotamia and that cylinder seals carried imagery tied to identity, status, and sometimes religious motifs. That is solid ground. And it matters because it gives you a real-world backdrop for the idea of civilizing powers being handled like valuables. One interpretation is that the me are a mythic mirror of institutional reality. In a city where temple offices, roles and rights determine who eats and who waits, it makes sense to imagine those things as cosmic items that can be possessed. A careful reading might suggest that the myth is not saying culture is a magic gift from nowhere, but that culture is fragile, transferable, and always under contest. Historians still argue whether the me should be understood as abstract principles, specific social roles, ritual prerogative, or a poetic bundle that refuses to be translated neatly into modern categories. There's no full consensus, and your mind can rest in that ambiguity like a cat in a sunbeam. Now, the Anunnaki hover at the edge of this topic because, in some later frames, groups of gods represent divine authority and order. The evidence we do have points to divine assemblies functioning as narrative devices to model governance. It's possible that when a story says a god holds the me, it is also saying legitimacy comes from alignment with the cosmic order. A more cautious explanation could be that this is an ideological reflection of how institutions justified themselves. You walk into the mythic scene where the me are involved in a transfer, a trick, or a negotiation. The atmosphere is not violent. It is social. It is the kind of story where the tension is in who gets invited to the banquet and who leaves with the keys. You sit at a low table in a hall lit by oil lamps. The light is honey-colored. Cups are passed. Someone laughs too loudly. Someone else pretends not to notice, which is the ancient version of politeness. A deity speaks with the smooth confidence of someone who has never had to wait in line for anything. And you, listening, realize the story is about persuasion as much as power. Most historians agree that feasting and gift exchange were important social practices in many ancient societies, and archaeology suggests that communal consumption and elite display played roles in political life. The evidence we do have points to banquets as places where alliances were formed and obligations created. That gives the myth a believable skeleton. The gods are doing what elites do, negotiating influence. One interpretation is that the story's blueprints of culture are a way to talk about how institutions are built through agreement and contest. Culture is not only invented, it is bargained for. It is stolen. It is defended. And because it is easier to talk about that in a safe symbolic register. The story places it among gods. Now the cinematic what if slips in like a whisper behind the curtain. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the me are not just metaphorical, but a memory of real technological and administrative innovations arriving in clusters, making the world feel like it changed overnight? Not necessarily from outsiders, not necessarily from the Anunnaki as literal visitors, but from sudden social acceleration, new tools, new rules, new hierarchies, new paperwork. If you have ever lived through a software update that changed everything, you can sympathize. Civilization got patched. A fringe idea proposes that the me were literal devices or advanced knowledge packages given by non-human beings, sometimes linked by popular rumor to the Anunnaki. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has a certain dramatic charm. It turns culture into a downloadable file. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a playful candle flame, not a courtroom verdict. So you picture it for a moment. A set of objects wrapped in cloth, sealed containers, a list of functions, a feeling that the world has rules you did not learn, only inherited. Then you set that image down, gently. What's broadly accepted is that human societies can develop complex institutions through cumulative innovation, and archaeology suggests that early Mesopotamia's complexity grew over long spans through environmental adaptation, trade, and social organization. The evidence we do have points to gradual change, punctuated by occasional bursts, not one single gift-dropping event. Here is a new development to keep the scene fresh. Consider the emotional tone of the me stories. They are not only about power, they are about anxiety. When a society catalogues what makes it work, it is also confessing what it fears losing. If you make a list of your skills, you're also admitting you worry they might vanish. The me are civilization's insecurity written in divine handwriting. You walk along a corridor where plaques and seals hang. Each one represents an office, a right, a duty. You can almost feel the weight of coordination. Someone must decide who gets to perform which ritual. Someone must decide who gets to control which storehouse. Someone must decide whose story becomes official. Historians still argue whether myths like these primarily serve to legitimize a specific city's religious claims, to entertain and instruct, or to negotiate tensions between competing institutions. Scholars continue to debate how local politics shaped the way divine power was narrated. There's no full consensus, and your mind can stay loose, not needing to pin it down. Now, if the Anunnaki are part of the atmosphere here, they function as a reminder that the cosmos itself is imagined as structured, a council, a hierarchy, a set of roles. It's possible that this mirrors the world of scribes and administrators. The universe runs on offices too. A more cautious explanation could be that humans naturally project their social organization upward, making the divine realm look like an idealized version of their own. You glance at the scribe again. He is still listing, still checking, still stamping. He looks up for a second and sighs, as if even gods cannot escape forms that need to be filed. You feel a tiny laugh rise in your chest. The first joke of the section, gentle and sleepy. Maybe the true ancient mystery is how paperwork survived every empire. Then another thought arrives. Calmer. The me concept might also be a way of saying that culture has ethics built into it. Certain powers are desirable, others are dangerous. The list can include things that feel contradictory, because societies are contradictory. They want order and freedom. They want passion and stability. They want truth and good stories. A careful reading might suggest that the myth acknowledges that contradiction without resolving it. It raises the possibility that the ancients understood civilization as a bundle of forces you manage, not a perfect system you achieve. Historians still argue whether we should read the me as a fixed canonical list or as a flexible concept that changes with context. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm a single definitive inventory of civilization. We can confirm that people tried to name it. You leave the storeroom and step back into the open air. Night insects make a steady sound like a tiny drum line. The temple walls hold warmth. You feel the city's quiet pride in its own complexity. And you carry one last image with you, a drawer labeled in neat signs, containing something as intangible as justice or as practical as weaving. A myth telling you that culture is a treasure and a burden, a puzzle, an open question, not a solved secret, just a set of clues you can hold lightly as you drift onward. You drift toward water again, but this time it is not a calm canal with reeds whispering politely. This is the kind of water that rearranges everything without asking permission. Most historians agree that southern Mesopotamia lived and died by rivers, and archaeology suggests that floods, shifts in river courses, and sediment layers shaped settlement patterns over long spans. The evidence we do have points to real environmental events that could leave strong cultural memories. You stand in a trench cut into earth, the kind archaeologists open to read time like a cake. The layers stack downward, broken bricks, ash, pottery fragments, a scatter of animal bone, the everyday leftovers of people living and rebuilding. Then you see a band that looks different, cleaner, almost sterile, a seam of mud laid down in one dramatic moment. Archaeology suggests that some sites contain flood deposits, and scholars discuss how to interpret them. This is solid ground, but it is also delicate ground, because one layer can be many things depending on the context. One interpretation is that flood stories in Mesopotamia compress multiple disasters into a single narrative, combining local events, regional flooding, and the general anxiety of living on a floodplain into one unforgettable plot. A careful reading might suggest that the myth is not trying to report a date, but to capture a feeling. The world can be wiped clean overnight, and your plans are not the boss of the river. Historians still argue whether specific flood layers at individual sites correspond to the flood narratives in later texts, or whether the stories are primarily literary constructions drawing on common experience rather than one singular catastrophe. There's no full consensus, and your mind can rest in the uncertainty like a boat rocking gently, not sinking, just moving. Now, when modern listeners hear flood stories and also hear names like Anunnaki in mythic contexts, the temptation is to connect everything into one grand, secret timeline. We will not do that. We will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The evidence we do have points to flood narratives existing across cultures. And in Mesopotamia, they likely reflect both real events and the narrative needs of communities trying to make sense of fragility. You move through a city street as clouds gather. The air thickens. The first drops of rain land on clay and darken it, turning dust into a smell that is oddly comforting. Then the drops become a sheet. Water runs along the street edges. People shout. Doors slam. Someone is hauling a goat that clearly does not want to participate in this weather emergency. The goat's face says, "I did not sign up for apocalypse." Fair. Most historians agree that ancient urban life involved constant maintenance of mud brick structures, because rain and water can melt your architecture back into the earth. Archaeology suggests repeated rebuilding and repairs, visible in layered walls and resurfaced floors. This mainstream fact matters because it shows why floods would feel existential. When your city is made of mud brick, water is not just scenery. It is a threat with fingers. One interpretation is that the flood myth functions like a cultural memory locker. It stores the lesson, respect the river, coordinate as a community, keep watch, prepare, and perhaps in a broader sense, except that human control is partial. A more cautious explanation could be that the story also serves theological goals, explaining why the world is the way it is, why suffering exists, why limits exist. Now the cinematic what-if arrives, but softly, like a fog that does not chase you, only surrounds you. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the flood is also a metaphor for political collapse? When a city is overwhelmed by forces beyond its control, invasion, famine, internal breakdown, water becomes the perfect symbol because it is both real and unstoppable. A fringe idea proposes that the flood stories preserve memory of a sudden global cataclysm, and that the Anunnaki, in some popular rumor, were involved as judges or engineers of the reset. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it offers a single dramatic event with a single dramatic explanation. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a story about human longing for clarity. We want one cause. We want one villain. We want one answer. History rarely cooperates. So you let that longing pass through you like water through reeds. You do not cling to it. You watch it move on. You step into a temple courtyard where people gather after the waters recede. The ground is slick. The walls are stained. Everyone looks exhausted in the way that makes even silence feel heavy. Someone lights a lamp, and the flame trembles, as if it is also tired. A scribe sits with a tablet and begins to record losses. This many jars destroyed. That many animals missing. This family displaced. It is not epic. It is grief in list form. Archaeology suggests that administrative texts often track disruptions, repairs, and redistribution after crises. The evidence we do have points to institutions playing roles in recovery, sometimes providing stability, sometimes tightening control. That is a new development for your mind. Disasters do not only destroy, they reorganize society. They can strengthen institutions and change power relationships. One interpretation is that flood myths, when told and retold, might reinforce the idea that order must be restored through proper ritual, proper leadership, proper alignment with divine will. It raises the possibility that the story is also a tool for social cohesion. We survived because we listened, because we obeyed, because we rebuilt together. Historians still argue whether the moral framing in different flood versions reflects changing political contexts, changing theological emphases, or different audiences. Scholars continue to debate how these narratives evolved from earlier forms to later literary compositions. There's no full consensus, and that is part of the charm. The story is a river too, changing course over time. Now, about the Anunnaki. In some texts and interpretations, divine groups function as decision-makers. If the Anunnaki appear in that broader divine council atmosphere, it's possible they represent the weight of cosmic order, the idea that there are forces above human life that determine outcomes. A more cautious explanation could be that divine councils are a narrative way to describe fate, unpredictability, and the logic of consequences. You stand at the riverbank in your imagination. The water looks innocent now, reflecting moonlight like polished stone. It is hard to believe it can rise and erase. That is the second light joke. Sleepy and modern. Rivers have excellent public relations until they suddenly do not. You dip your fingers in. The water is cold. You feel how quickly it pulls heat from your skin. It reminds you that nature is not personal. It is not angry. It is not kind. It simply behaves. And humans, living beside it, have to build meaning around that behavior. One interpretation is that flood myths serve as a bridge between observation and emotion. You observe that water rises. You feel fear, You tell a story that gives the fear a shape and a voice. You name divine beings. You imagine reasons. You create a framework where survival feels like it has rules. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it is a gentle way to understand why such stories endure without forcing them into a literal timeline. Here is the third light joke, because your mind deserves a little smile before it drifts. If you ever feel overwhelmed by your inbox, remember that ancient scribes had to inventory flood damage in wet clay, which is like doing paperwork while the paper is still soup. You watch the city begin to rebuild. Mud brick is mixed. Walls rise again. Streets are scraped clean. The cycle resumes. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cities were resilient, repeatedly rebuilt after destruction. Archaeology suggests long sequences of construction and reconstruction, visible in layered architecture. The evidence we do have points to persistence as a defining feature. Historians still argue whether the flood narrative should be read as memory of specific events, as a literary motif, or as a cultural synthesis of many floods into one story of limits and renewal. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can confirm rivers flood. We can confirm people told stories. We cannot confirm the story maps neatly onto one single real flood. So you let the river keep its secret. You let the city keep its courage. You let the myth remain what it is. Part documented experience, part interpretation, part gentle imagination, and you walk on, with the sound of water in your ears, like a lullaby that never repeats the same note twice. You step into a story that begins with a complaint, which is honestly the most human way to start anything. Most historians agree that the Atrahasis narrative, in the form we know it, is a literary composition that preserves older Mesopotamian themes about creation, labor, and divine decision-making. Archaeology suggests that these texts circulated in scribal settings where people copied, studied, and reshaped them. The evidence we do have points to a world where myth could function like a mirror held up to society. Reflecting its tensions in divine costume, you are in a workshop at dawn. The air is thick with smoke from kilns and the sour, sweet scent of wet clay. Laborers move like shadows, hauling baskets, mixing mud, lifting bricks. Their backs look tired in that quiet way that does not need a speech. Someone mutters that the day has barely started and it already feels like a week. A donkey snorts as if it agrees. The donkey is the closest thing to a philosopher here. In Atrahasis, the gods complain that they are doing too much work. That sounds strange until you remember how ancient stories often speak in inversions. The divine realm becomes a stage where human realities can be explored. Most historians agree that ancient societies were structured by labor obligations, hierarchy, and institutional control. The evidence we do have points to large projects, organized workforces, and systems that demanded coordination and, sometimes, coercion. One interpretation is that the myth dramatizes social tensions about who works and who benefits. A careful reading might suggest that the divine labor complaint is a safe way to talk about human labor complaint. If gods can grumble about workload, then ordinary people can feel seen without directly challenging the people in charge. It's possible that the myth offers a kind of pressure valve. Historians still argue whether Atrahasis should be read primarily as a theological explanation for why humans exist, as a political reflection of labor organization, or as a literary work that blends multiple motives. Scholars continue to debate how the text evolved and what earlier versions may have looked like. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is part of its texture. Now comes the creation solution. Humans are made to take on the work. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian creation stories often tie humanity to service, ritual duty, and maintaining order. The evidence we do have points to humans as caretakers of temples, fields, canals, and offerings in the ideological worldview of the time. This does not mean everyone believed it the same way, but it means the texts present a clear theme. Humans are part of a cosmic economy. One interpretation is that this is not just theology, but social logic. If your society depends on organized labor to keep water flowing and food stored, you will likely develop narratives that frame such labor as meaningful, even sacred. A more cautious explanation could be that the myth also justifies hierarchy by making it feel natural. Work is your purpose. So do not question it too loudly. Now the Anunnaki float near the edges again, because in some later readings, divine groups are imagined as decision-makers who approve the plan. The evidence we do have points to divine councils as a common mythic device. It's possible that when texts describe gods deliberating, it reflects the reality that important decisions in city life were also made by councils, elders, or administrators. A careful reading might suggest that the cosmos is being modeled on the city, and now the cinematic what if arrives. But it does not shout, it leans in. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the creation of humans to work is not only a mythic theme but a memory of social transitions? When expanding institutions needed more labor, more records, more predictable service. In that kind of shift, people can feel as if a new order was imposed from above. It can feel like gods decided your schedule. A fringe idea proposes that Atrahasis preserves a literal account of engineered humanity, sometimes linked by popular rumor to the Anunnaki as biological designers. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has modern appeal because it reframes ancient anxiety as science fiction. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes an atmospheric lens, not a historical claim. So you hold the lens up briefly. You imagine a quiet room where decisions are made in a language you do not understand. You imagine a plan. You imagine humans introduced into a system to stabilize it. It is eerie in a calm way, like hearing a distant bell in fog. Then you set the lens down and return to solid ground. Most historians agree that ancient myths use symbolic language, and archaeology suggests that social complexity can generate stories about order, duty, and purpose. The evidence we do have points to humans shaping myths as much as myths shape humans. Now the story takes another turn. There is a crisis of noise. Humans multiply. Their activity disturbs the gods. This noise can be read literally as sound, but a careful reading might suggest it is a metaphor for disruption, overpopulation, social strain, or the stress of a world becoming crowded. One interpretation is that the myth encodes the idea that unchecked growth creates instability. A more cautious explanation could be that it reflects elite anxiety about the masses. Too many people, too many demands, too much unpredictability. Historians still argue whether the noise theme should be understood as ecological concern, social control rhetoric, or a narrative device to justify a catastrophe. There's no full consensus. And that is fine. The myth does not need a single key. It is a room with multiple doors. You stand in a city street at midday. It is loud. Children shout. Potters bang clay. Sellers call out prices. Someone argues about a missing jar lid as if the jar lid is the crown jewel of the kingdom. The argument is so intense you almost want to take notes, because if passion were fuel, this city could power the sun. That is your first light joke of the section. Ancient people could turn any minor inconvenience into an epic. Then the mood shifts. The gods discuss solutions. Disasters are sent in some versions. Again, we stay calm and PG-13, focusing on the idea rather than any graphic detail. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian flood and disaster motifs appear across multiple narratives, and that these motifs can reflect both lived experience and literary tradition. The evidence we do have points to the real vulnerability of communities facing drought, disease, and flooding. One interpretation is that the narrative is less about divine cruelty and more about boundary setting. It raises the possibility that the story is exploring the idea of limits. Limits to growth. Limits to noise. Limits to disruption. A careful reading might suggest that catastrophe functions as an extreme metaphor for recalibration. Now your mind notices something new and interesting. The hero figure, Atrahasis, is not just a survivor. He is a mediator. He receives warnings. He follows instructions. He navigates between ordinary life and divine decision-making. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian narratives often elevate a wise or favored human who represents order and piety. The evidence we do have points to a literary pattern: the hero who listens. One interpretation is that Atrahasis represents the ideal citizen from the perspective of institutions: attentive, compliant, resourceful, and loyal. A more cautious explanation could be that he also embodies communal hope. Someone will figure it out. Someone will keep us afloat. Historians still argue whether the hero's role reflects a priestly worldview, a royal ideology, or broader cultural values about wisdom and obedience. Scholars continue to debate what social group most shaped the narrative's form. There's no full consensus, and your mind can relax into the debate without needing to resolve it. Here is your second light joke. Sleepy and modern. If the gods are bothered by human noise, they would not survive a modern group chat. The divine council would file a complaint and immediately mute everyone. And here is the third. Because we keep it gentle. If you have ever felt your to-do list multiplying like rabbits, congratulations. You have touched the same existential theme Atrahasis is wrestling with. Work expands. Life gets loud. People look for meaning. Now, where does that leave the Anunnaki? If they appear in this narrative atmosphere as part of the divine collective, they function as a symbol of cosmic governance. The idea that reality has administrators. It's possible that this reflects how people experienced institutions. Decisions came from distant rooms. Consequences arrived in the streets. A more cautious explanation could be that the story simply uses divine group language to represent fate and the unknown. Historians still argue whether divine assemblies in Mesopotamian texts should be read as reflections of actual political assemblies, as theological constructs, or as literary conventions. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can confirm the text's themes. We cannot confirm a single literal event behind every motif, so you let the story remain what it is. Part documented literary tradition, part interpretation of social reality, part gentle imagination. You step out of the workshop, out of the noise, and into a quieter lane where the evening air cools your skin. Somewhere, a reed stylus taps on clay, steady as breathing, and the city, loud and fragile, keeps living. You climb steps that are not trying to impress you, but they succeed anyway. Each one is wide, worn, and slightly uneven, as if time has been practicing its handwriting here. Most historians agree that ziggurats were monumental temple structures in Mesopotamia, tied to civic identity and religious practice, and archaeology suggests they functioned as sacred platforms rather than observatories or launch pads. Even if modern imaginations love to add rockets, the evidence we do have points to human engineering, organized labor, and a deep desire to make a meeting place between earth and the divine. You reach the halfway point and pause. Because you're in a sleep-friendly story and we allow breaks. Also, stairs are rude. That is your first light joke. Ancient people built spiritual architecture, and the universe responded by inventing calves that ache. The air up here tastes cleaner. You can smell baked brick, dust, and something faintly sweet from offerings below. A priest passes carrying a small basket. His sandals slap softly on the steps. He nods to you with the calm of someone who has done this walk so many times that his body knows it better than his mind. What's broadly accepted is that ziggurats were associated with temples and cult practice, and that their construction required centralized organization. The evidence we do have points to administrative systems capable of mobilizing labor and resources. This is mainstream ground that matters because it shows you what cities could do when they coordinated, and it hints at why monumental structures felt supernatural to ordinary eyes. One interpretation is that the ziggurat is a political statement as much as a religious one. A careful reading might suggest that when a city builds a mountain out of brick on a flat plain, it is declaring, we are the center. We can command time, labor, and material. We can reach up. It's possible the structure served as a constant reminder of institutional power, visible from far away. Now, in some mythic language, divine beings are imagined as moving between realms. If you sprinkle the word Anunnaki over that image, you get a modern mood, watchers, councils, beings observing from above. But we will keep it careful. The evidence we do have points to divine hierarchies and assemblies in Mesopotamian religion. Yet the precise role of any named group shifts across texts and contexts. It's possible that the idea of watchers is more modern framing than ancient category. But it fits the human feeling of being seen. Historians still argue whether the primary meaning of ziggurats was symbolic connection to the divine, practical separation of sacred space, political prestige, or a blend that changes by city and period. There's no full consensus, and the debate itself is like wind around the bricks, always present, never damaging, just shaping how you hear the place. You continue upward. The city below spreads out like a patterned blanket. You see courtyards, narrow lanes, rooftops with sleeping mats rolled up, ovens that have cooled, and a few late figures moving like quiet ink strokes. Somewhere, a dog barks once and then seems to regret it, returning to silence. Here is a new development for your mind. The ziggurat is not only a symbol of height, but a symbol of separation. The sacred is elevated, not just physically but socially. Only certain people go all the way up regularly. Most people stay below. Archaeology suggests that temple complexes were structured spaces with controlled access. The evidence we do have points to stratification, roles, and boundaries. One interpretation is that elevation creates authority. When your rituals happen above the rooftops, they feel more cosmic. When decisions are made near the temple, they feel ordained. This might support the idea that sacred architecture reinforced hierarchy without needing to say it out loud. A more cautious explanation could be that elevation was also practical, protecting sacred spaces from floodwater and chaos, because mud brick cities need all the help they can get. Now the cinematic what if arrives, and it is almost too easy here, so we handle it like hot tea. What if the stairway is a dial you can turn? What if each step brings you closer, not to a god, but to a different state of mind? Your breathing slows, your view widens, your worries shrink. In that sense, the ziggurat becomes an ancient technology of attention. A fringe idea proposes that ziggurats were built as beacons or contact points for non-human visitors, sometimes linked by popular rumor to the Anunnaki. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is persistent, because tall things invite big stories. if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. It becomes a cinematic overlay. You can imagine lights, signals, distant watchers, without claiming it happened. So you imagine it for a moment. A pale glow at the top platform. A hush in the air as if sound is being absorbed. A feeling that the sky is listening. Not a spaceship, not a landing, just that quiet. Odd sensation that you are tiny under something vast. Then you return to solid ground. What's broadly accepted is that ziggurats were human-built religious monuments. Archaeology suggests their construction phases, materials, and associated temples. The evidence we do have points to human hands, human planning, human labor, and human belief. You reach the top platform. The wind is stronger here. It carries the smell of river water and distant cooking fires. The priest sets down the basket and begins a small ritual. Maybe incense, maybe libation, maybe words spoken softly. You cannot hear every syllable, but you feel the tone, and tone is enough. One interpretation is that rituals on elevated platforms serve to align the city with cosmic order, to reassure people that their lives were connected to something stable. It raises the possibility that the watching feeling is not supernatural surveillance, but communal comfort. Someone is paying attention. Someone is keeping the world from falling apart. Historians still argue whether the rituals performed on ziggurats were primarily public spectacle or mostly restricted priestly practice, and they debate how much ordinary citizens participated directly versus indirectly through offerings and festivals. Scholars continue to debate the sensory experience of these spaces. Because the evidence is partial and the performances are gone, you look at the horizon and notice how easy it is to imagine a council up in the sky. Clouds form layers. Stars appear one by one. Your brain, that pattern-hungry creature, wants to arrange them into meaning. This is where divine assemblies make emotional sense. It's possible that the Anunnaki, in some later interpretive frames, represent the feeling of structured power above, like a committee that runs the universe. The thought is both comforting and mildly annoying, because committees are rarely efficient. That is your second light joke. If the cosmos is run by a council, then the universe has definitely had meetings that could have been an email. Now, here is the third light joke. Softer. If you are ever feeling small, remember that you are still taller than a wedge-shaped cuneiform sign, which is not a high bar, but we take wins where we can. You sit on the platform's edge. The brick beneath you is cool. Your heartbeat slows. You can hear the city below as a low murmur, like a distant sea. For a moment, you understand why people built this. Not because they needed to, but because they wanted to feel connected to something larger. Historians still argue whether the human desire to connect earth and sky is the main driver behind such structures, or whether the structures primarily served as political theater that later gained spiritual depth. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can confirm the bricks. We can confirm the temples. We can confirm the labor. We cannot confirm exactly what every person felt when they looked up. So you let your own feeling be simple. The wind is cool. The stars are quiet. The stairway behind you is a long, slow exhale back to the street. And somewhere in the language of myth, divine watchers may exist as symbols, as possibilities, as the mind's way of naming the sensation of being seen by the night. You walk beside water that behaves like a secret. Not the roaring flood water of panic, not the wide river of trade, but the quieter water that moves through channels, underfloors, into jars, into mouths, into crops, into everything. Most historians agree that in southern Mesopotamia, controlling water meant controlling survival. And archaeology suggests that canals, levees, and irrigation networks were essential to the rise of cities. The evidence we do have points to a landscape where engineering was not optional. It was daily prayer with shovels. You crouch at a canal gate. The wood is swollen from moisture, dark and slick. A worker adjusts a latch with careful hands. He looks at you with the calm suspicion of someone who has seen too many untrained people near important infrastructure. That is fair. If you have ever watched someone open a complicated packaging box with scissors and pure confidence, you understand why he is worried. One interpretation is that many myths tied to water deities preserve practical wisdom in sacred form. It's possible that stories about Enki, the freshwater deep, and the ordering of the world served as cultural memory for how to live in a wetland world without drowning in it. A careful reading might suggest that secret knowledge is often just knowledge that not everyone has access to, like the plan of canals, the timing of releases, the rituals that synchronize labor, and the rules that prevent chaos. Historians still argue whether the earliest water-related myths reflect direct environmental observation, institutional ideology, or later theological layering that retrofits older local beliefs into a grand system. There's no full consensus, and the debate feels appropriate here, because water itself refuses to hold still. You follow the canal toward a temple complex. The ground is damp. Reeds brush your legs. You hear insects and the occasional splash of something small darting away. The city smells like wet clay and cooked grain. A child runs past carrying a jug, sloshing water with the reckless joy of someone who is not responsible for the cleanup. That is your first light joke. In every era, the greatest threat to water management is a child with enthusiasm. Archaeology suggests that temples were deeply involved in managing resources, including water, labor, and storage. The evidence we do have points to administrative systems that could coordinate large projects. This is mainstream ground, and it matters because it makes the myths feel less like fantasies and more like cultural explanations for how the world stays organized. Now you enter a dim room where a priest and a scribe speak quietly. A tablet rests on a stand. A small bowl of water sits nearby, its surface perfectly still. The priest dips his fingers in and draws a symbol on the clay, then gestures as if the symbol is both a prayer and a plan. One interpretation is that ritual and engineering were not separate categories for these communities. It's possible they experienced water management as sacred responsibility. The canal is not just a ditch, it is a lifeline. If you frame it as sacred, people treat it with respect. A more cautious explanation could be that such framing also supports institutional authority. If water is sacred and temples manage sacred things, then temple power becomes natural. Now, the Anunnaki enter as a soft shadow, not a loud claim. In some texts, divine groups function as authorities within a cosmic order. If the Anunnaki are imagined as part of that order, it's possible they represent the way people felt about invisible governance. Water flows because someone opened a gate. Crops grow because someone coordinated labor. Fate unfolds because someone decided. A careful reading might suggest that divine councils are narrative models of decision-making and responsibility. Historians still argue whether references to divine assemblies reflect literal theological beliefs held consistently across communities, or whether they are literary and institutional language that shifts by time and place. Scholars continue to debate how local cults, political changes, and scribal traditions shaped these depictions. There's no full consensus, and the lack of certainty makes room for calm curiosity. Now the cinematic what if arrives, but it stays polite. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if hidden instructions in water myths reflect real technical knowledge held by specialists? People who knew how to read water like a text to ordinary citizens. Those specialists could seem almost magical. You see a man adjust a gate by an inch, and a week later the fields are green. That feels like sorcery if you do not know hydraulics. A fringe idea proposes that the secrets of the deep are encoded descriptions of advanced technology or non-human teaching, sometimes linked by popular rumor to the Anunnaki as mentors. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it turns expertise into mystery. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a way to honor how strange knowledge can feel when you do not possess it. So you let your mind picture a teacher figure in the lamplight, explaining water in a language that sounds like poetry, a diagram scratched in clay, a hand tracing flow paths, a hush, because what is being taught matters. Then you release that image gently and step back to solid ground. Human societies can develop sophisticated engineering through trial, error, and accumulated experience. Archaeology suggests long-term landscape modification and infrastructure, visible in settlement patterns and waterworks. The evidence we do have points to human ingenuity, and plenty of human arguments about whose field gets watered first. You walk through a marketplace where sellers call out their goods. A fishmonger holds up a catch and brags as if the fish personally volunteered. A farmer complains about salinity in his soil, and another person complains about the complainer. The city hums. Here is your second light joke. If the gods truly controlled water, they would still not be able to control gossip, which flows faster and floods more often. One interpretation is that myths about water gods and hidden wisdom also reflect a cultural respect for boundaries. Fresh water versus salt water. Order versus chaos. Controlled flow versus destructive surge. These are not only physical distinctions, they are metaphors for social life. A careful reading might suggest that the deep is a symbol for the unknown and the unmanageable, while the canal is the symbol for what humans can shape through cooperation. Historians still argue whether the deep, in myths about fresh water, should be understood as a literal conception of subterranean waters, a symbolic realm, or a poetic device to describe mystery and abundance. Scholars continue to debate how ancient people conceptualized their environment. There's no full consensus, and it is comforting to realize that even experts disagree about how ancient minds pictured what lay under their feet. Now comes a new development that keeps the story moving. Imagine how water control creates paperwork. Every release, every assignment of labor, every repair, every dispute over boundaries becomes a record. The scribe who tracks grain also tracks canal days. This is not merely a side detail. It means water management is part of the written world. It becomes institutional memory. What's broadly accepted is that writing in Mesopotamia was heavily used for administrative purposes, and the evidence we do have points to extensive record-keeping. One interpretation is that secret instructions in myth could be a poetic reflection of how knowledge gets locked into institutions. Some people have access to the records and the training, and others only see the outcomes. Now, the third light joke. Because it is late and your mind deserves a smile. If ancient gods had truly hidden the ultimate secrets in water, someone would have spilled them by now, because humans spill everything, including literal water. You return to the canal gate. The worker closes it and listens. There is a moment when the water sound changes, a subtle shift from rush to steady whisper. He nods, satisfied. In that nod is a whole philosophy. Small adjustments matter. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian myths about water and wisdom were primarily crafted to support temple authority, to preserve practical knowledge, or to explore existential questions about order and chaos. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can confirm canals. We can confirm texts. We can confirm divine language. We cannot confirm exactly how any single story was experienced in every household. So you let the canal keep flowing in your mind, a narrow ribbon of life through the night. You let the hidden instructions remain a gentle possibility, not a solved secret. And you continue walking with the quiet sound of water beside you, as steady and soothing as breath. You step into a story that feels like someone stole the keys to reality and then ran off laughing into the desert. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths often used dramatic conflicts to explore authority, and archaeology suggests that scribal schools preserved these narratives because they taught values, order, and the consequences of disruption. The evidence we do have points to a world where legitimacy mattered so much that even gods needed paperwork for it, at least in myth. Tonight, the object of authority is imagined as a tablet of destinies, a symbolic item that represents control over the cosmic order. What's broadly accepted is that in several Mesopotamian traditions, divine objects and inscriptions represent legitimacy, and that stories about their theft or transfer function as political theology. The evidence we do have points to a culture where written words carried power. If you can write the rules, you can run the game. You're in a temple archive room. It is cool and dim. Shelves hold tablets stacked like small bricks of memory. The air smells like clay and oil smoke and the faint must of reed mats. A scribe sits with a stylus, and his face says he has seen too much. He looks up and gives you the slow blink of someone who has just discovered that a critical document is missing. That is your first light joke. The earliest horror genre is not monsters. It is missing paperwork. The mythic scene shifts. A creature, often called Anzu in later forms, takes the tablet of destinies and disrupts the cosmic order. Whether you picture Anzu as bird-like, storm-like, or simply as a symbol of chaotic ambition depends on the version and the storyteller. Most historians agree that mythic adversaries often represent threats to legitimate authority, and that these threats can reflect real concerns in human society: rebellion, usurpation, disorder. The evidence we do have points to stories being used as frameworks for thinking about governance. One interpretation is that the Tablet of Destinies is not a literal object but a symbol of sovereignty. A careful reading might suggest that it stands for the right to decide, to decree, to define what is true and binding. In a culture where writing is power, a divine tablet becomes the perfect metaphor. It's possible the story is teaching that legitimacy is fragile and must be defended. Historians still argue whether myths about stolen authority reflect specific political moments, such as shifts in dynasties or city dominance, or whether they are more timeless narrative patterns reshaped repeatedly. There's no full consensus. And the debate is soothing because it reminds you that stories can carry many meanings without needing one final answer. Now, the Anunnaki come into the atmosphere as a council-like presence, depending on the telling. The evidence we do have points to divine assemblies being a common way to represent decision-making. It's possible that when a myth says the cosmic order is disrupted, it reflects a human fear. What if the rules change suddenly, and the people you depend on are powerless to stop it? A careful reading might suggest that divine councils are mirrors of human councils, where power is negotiated, contested, and sometimes stolen. You feel the world tilt slightly, not in a frightening way, but in a surreal way. Like when you wake from a nap and cannot remember what year it is for 2 seconds. The winds outside the temple shift. The lamps flicker. The priest mutters that this is not ideal timing for cosmic instability. He says it the way a modern person says. This is not ideal timing for the internet to go down. That is your second light joke. Even the gods cannot escape the inconvenience of systems failing at the worst possible moment. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian societies relied on stable administrative systems, The evidence we do have points to writing being central to maintaining order. Contracts, lists, legal records, temple accounts. This mainstream anchor matters because it makes the myth's symbolism hit harder. If your world is held together by recorded rules, the idea of a stolen rule tablet is not fantasy. It is a nightmare dressed as poetry. One interpretation is that the myth externalizes a social truth. Authority is always contested. There is always someone who wants to take control of the narrative, the law, the legitimacy. A more cautious explanation could be that the story also reassures listeners, even if chaos rises. Order can be restored through rightful action and communal alignment. Now the cinematic what-if slides in, softly, like moonlight on a blade. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if destiny is not fate carved in stone, but a metaphor for governance systems, calendars, ritual schedules, agricultural cycles, and law codes? When those systems are disrupted, life becomes uncertain. It feels like destiny itself has been stolen. A fringe idea proposes that the tablet of destinies was a real advanced device, a control mechanism for weather or human behavior, sometimes linked in popular rumor to the Anunnaki as operators of a hidden technology. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals to modern minds because it translates myth into hardware. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a cinematic lens that adds chill without making claims. So you picture a device for a moment, a slab that hums faintly, symbols that shift like light, a sense that whoever holds it can rewrite parameters. Then you put that image down and return to the safer ground of symbolism, literature, and social meaning. You watch as a champion deity is chosen to retrieve the stolen authority. In many mythic patterns, chaos must be confronted by a figure who represents rightful strength. Most historians agree that heroic combat motifs appear widely and serve to dramatize the restoration of order. The evidence we do have points to these narratives teaching values: courage, loyalty, the proper use of power. One interpretation is that the champion represents the ideal enforcer of legitimacy, strong enough to act, aligned enough to be trusted. It's possible the story is asking a political question in mythic form. Who should wield force, and under what authority? A careful reading might suggest that the conflict is less about violence and more about re-establishing a moral and legal framework. Historians still argue whether the specific champion choice and the story's details reflect local cult priorities, shifting theology, or the influence of different scribal traditions. Scholars continue to debate how the story traveled and changed. There's no full consensus, and the shifting versions remind you that even destiny tablets are not destiny-proof in the hands of copyists. Here is a new development to keep your mind awake, just enough to stay interested, but not enough to check your phone. The myth is also about information security. If the cosmic order can be stolen, then the cosmos has a vulnerability. The gods have a system, and systems can be hacked. This is not ancient cybersecurity advice, but it is surprisingly relatable. That is your third light joke. The first data breach was mythic, and the IT department was divine, and they still needed a hero. You feel the restoration arrive not as fireworks, but as steadiness. The lamps stop flickering, the wind calms. The priest exhales like someone who just fixed a catastrophic scheduling error. The scribe finds the missing tablet, metaphorically or literally, and the archive feels safe again. Most historians agree that these myths work by turning abstract concerns into tangible objects and events. Archaeology suggests that the importance of writing and record-keeping in Mesopotamia made such symbolism emotionally powerful. The evidence we do have points to a society where documents mattered, and so stories about documents could carry deep meaning. Historians still argue whether the tablet of destinies should be read as a purely literary symbol, a theological concept of divine decree, or a reflection of real social anxieties about law and legitimacy. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can confirm that myths speak about authority objects. We cannot confirm a single, literal object that controlled reality. So you let the stolen tablet remain what it is, a story-shaped warning and a story-shaped comfort. Authority can be disrupted, order can return, and your mind, listening in the dark, can rest in that rhythm, as steady as the soft tapping of a reed stylus returning to clay. You enter a hall of figures that are not quite gods and not quite humans, the kind of beings that make your mind tilt its head and say, "Wait, what am I looking at?" Most historians agree that Mesopotamian tradition includes legendary sages known as Apkallu, often linked in later descriptions with the transmission of wisdom and culture. And archaeology suggests that protective figures and hybrid imagery were common in Mesopotamian art and ritual contexts. The evidence we do have points to a rich symbolic world where the boundary between human and divine could be expressed through costume, metaphor, and myth. You stand in a courtyard where a sculpted guardian figure watches the doorway. It has the calm, patient expression of something that has been posted here for centuries and has not once been offered a chair. The stone surface is cool. The carving shows wings, animal features, human posture. You do not need to decide whether it is literal or purely symbolic to feel its purpose. It is meant to protect, to warn, to reassure. One interpretation is that hybrid figures in Mesopotamian culture represent the idea of crossing categories, strength plus intelligence, animal power plus human skill, earth plus sky. A careful reading might suggest that the Apkallu, as sages, function like idealized teachers. The kind who arrive already knowing how to do everything and somehow never misplace their stylus. That is your first light joke. The Apkallu are basically the ancient fantasy of a mentor who does not say, "Have you tried turning it off and on again?" and then walk away. What's broadly accepted is that Apkallu traditions are more clearly attested in later Mesopotamian texts and iconography, and that they are associated with primordial wisdom, crafts, and ritual knowledge. The evidence we do have points to a concept of ancestral teachers or culture bringers. This matters because it shows how societies explain their own sophistication. When you look at weaving, writing, medicine, law, and architecture, you can either say, humans figured it out slowly, or you can tell a story where wisdom arrived in a concentrated form through special beings. Historians still argue whether the Apkallu should be understood primarily as mythic beings, as symbolic representations of priestly scholars, or as a tradition that developed over time to legitimize certain lines of knowledge and authority. There's no full consensus. And the debate is gentle here, because the Apkallu themselves are already halfway in the mist. Now, the fish cloak imagery, often linked to Apkallu, can feel especially strange to modern eyes. You imagine a figure wearing a fish skin like a mantle, the head of the fish hanging behind like a hood. It looks theatrical. It looks ritual. It looks like someone decided that the best way to convey wisdom was to dress like the river's mood. A careful reading might suggest that fish imagery connects sages with fresh water, fertility, and the life-giving abundance of rivers and marshes. It's possible that the fish cloak is a symbol of origin, a reminder that life and knowledge come from the waters that sustain the land. A more cautious explanation could be that ritual costumes helped transmit and preserve priestly identity and tradition, making the teacher look like the story. Now, the Anunnaki enter, not as a loud claim, but as a background association that modern audiences often make in some later religious frameworks. Divine groups sit above the world as authorities, while sages or semi-divine figures operate as intermediaries who bring wisdom down into human hands. The evidence we do have points to layered divine hierarchies in Mesopotamian thought. It's possible that Apkallu stories function as bridges between the distant realm of gods and the practical world of canals and bricks. Historians still argue whether this layering reflects early theological structures or later systematization by scribes who wanted the cosmos to look organized. Scholars continue to debate how much of what we call Mesopotamian religion is a patchwork of local traditions later stitched into broader frameworks. There's no full consensus, and your mind can rest in that stitching process. Now, the cinematic what if arrives. And it is tempting, because these sages feel like they belong in a mystery story by design. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if culture bringers reflect moments when new techniques spread rapidly, carried by traveling experts, merchants, or priestly networks? To a community receiving unfamiliar knowledge, the teacher can feel otherworldly. You do not need aliens to get that feeling. You only need a person who knows something you do not. A fringe idea proposes that the Apkallu were literal, non-human visitors or genetically distinct beings who taught humans advanced skills, sometimes linked by popular rumor to the Anunnaki as a broader visiting group. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives in modern imagination because it offers a clean origin story for complexity. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mood, the sense of being instructed by someone older than your own world. So you let the mood settle briefly. You picture an evening class in a temple courtyard. Lamps flicker. A teacher speaks in a calm voice. He draws signs in clay with a stylus, and the signs look like tiny doors. The students copy. The teacher corrects. The night air smells of wet reeds and smoke. Everything feels ordinary and strange at the same time. Then you return to solid ground. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian knowledge traditions developed through long-term practice, institutional training, and the accumulation of texts and techniques. Archaeology suggests a world of specialized crafts and learned professions. The evidence we do have points to humans teaching humans, generation by generation. Here is a new development for your mind. And it is subtle but important. The Apkallu tradition is also about legitimacy. If you can claim your knowledge descends from primordial sages, then your profession gains authority. A healer becomes more than a healer. A priest becomes more than a ritual specialist. A scribe becomes more than a clerk. They become guardians of an ancient stream of wisdom. One interpretation is that Apkallu stories helped professional classes justify their status and their control of specialized knowledge. Historians still argue whether this legitimation function was central from the start, or emerged later as institutions grew more complex. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is a reminder that stories evolve with the needs of the people who tell them. You walk into a small room where clay tablets are stacked in neat piles. Some are exercises, some are rituals, some are omens, some are medical recipes. A scribe runs his finger along a line of signs, murmuring as if the words are both instruction and charm. Most historians agree that scribal culture preserved a wide range of knowledge. The evidence we do have points to texts that cover everything from accounting to literature, from law to divination. Now you see the Apkallu theme in a new way. They are not just mysterious beings. They are a personification of the library itself. They are the idea that knowledge has ancestors. They are the feeling you get when you open an old book and sense the presence of every reader who came before you. That is your second light joke. The Apkallu are basically the original user manual, except instead of being 400 pages of confusion, they at least dress dramatically. You step outside again and look at the guardian figure by the door. Its wings are still. Its eyes are carved stone. Yet it seems to hold attention. You understand why people placed such figures at thresholds. Thresholds are where anxiety gathers. They are where you need reassurance that the boundary will hold. A careful reading might suggest that Apkallu and related protective beings were part of a wider ritual system designed to keep chaos outside. It's possible that the sages are not only teachers, but defenders. They bring order, and they help maintain it. If the Anunnaki represent distant authority in some interpretations, then the Apkallu represent hands-on expertise, the council and the craftsman, the decree and the technique. Historians still argue whether these roles were conceived consistently across different regions and times, and they debate how much modern categories distort ancient ones. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can confirm the images and the texts. We cannot confirm a single literal identity for every sage-like figure in the tradition. Here is your third light joke. Soft and sleepy. If you ever feel like you are pretending to be an adult, remember that ancient priests wore fish cloaks to look wise, and somehow everyone took it seriously. Confidence is timeless. You let that thought fade into a calmer image. A teacher's voice in the lamplight, the scratch of stylus on clay, the quiet thrill of learning something that will outlast you. Whether the Apkallu are myth, symbol, or a blend, they carry that thrill. And you carry it too as you walk onward into the night, unhurried, curious, and gently skeptical in the best way. You arrive at a city that feels less like a place and more like a filing system with streets. Most historians agree that Nippur was a major religious center in Mesopotamia, closely associated with the god Enlil. And archaeology suggests it held an unusual prestige even when political power shifted elsewhere. The evidence we do have points to temples, archives, and a dense scribal culture. The kind of environment where words gain weight and ceremonies feel like law. You enter through a gate and immediately sense the difference. In some cities, the marketplace is the heart. Here, it feels like the archive is the heart. The air carries dust and inkless clay, that dry scent of stored tablets. You hear the soft thud of clay bricks and the softer thud of human ambition. A priest passes with a tablet under his arm as if it is a passport. A scribe follows, looking nervous in the way people look when they are carrying something important and fragile. That is your first light joke. In a city like this, even the gossip probably needs to be stamped and filed before it is allowed to spread. Archaeology suggests that Nippur contains extensive remains of temple complexes and layers of occupation, and the evidence we do have points to its role as a religious and cultural hub. Most historians agree that it mattered to legitimacy. If a ruler could claim favor from the central cult, that claim could strengthen authority. This is mainstream ground, and it matters because it shows how religion and politics intertwined without needing to become conspiracy. One interpretation is that Nippur functioned like a spiritual capital, not always the seat of armies, but the seat of approval. A careful reading might suggest that such a center helps stabilize a region of competing city-states by providing a shared sacred reference point. It's possible that the city's influence was partly ideological. If everyone agrees that certain rituals and declarations matter, then the people who manage those rituals and declarations hold real power. Now, in myths and theological language, the cosmos is often imagined as a kingdom with administration. Divine assemblies appear as councils that decree, judge, and organize. The evidence we do have points to this being a common narrative form. If you are tempted to picture the Anunnaki here as a divine committee, you are not alone. But we keep it careful. The role of any specific named group varies by text and time, and modern expectations can overfit patterns. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian divine councils reflect human political assemblies directly, or whether they are primarily theological constructs that happen to resemble councils because humans think in social structures. Scholars continue to debate how much these councils changed across periods. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty fits Nippur perfectly. Because even the city's meaning shifts depending on who is writing about it. You walk into a courtyard where scribes sit in clusters. They are copying texts with the kind of focus that makes you feel guilty for ever complaining about your own concentration. A teacher points at a sign and corrects a student. The student nods, like someone who has learned that arguing with the person who grades your work is a lifestyle choice with consequences. Archaeology suggests that scribal education was structured, and the evidence we do have points to texts being copied, stored, and disseminated. This mainstream anchor matters because it explains why Nippur could function as a kind of memory bank for the region. If you control the copying, you influence what becomes standard. One interpretation is that the bureaucracy of the divine in myth mirrors the bureaucracy of the city. It's possible that temple systems, with their records, offerings, and schedules, inspired a cosmic analogy. The gods also keep accounts. A more cautious explanation could be that the analogy works both ways. Myths teach people to accept bureaucracy as natural by framing it as cosmic. If the universe has a schedule, then your schedule feels less insulting. Now the cinematic what if arrives, but it does not become a claim. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if divine councils are the psychological solution to uncertainty? When power shifts, when wars happen, when crops fail, it is comforting to imagine a higher court that still has order. A cosmic courtroom where decisions are made with purpose. Even if the purpose is hidden, a fringe idea proposes that Nippur and cities like it were nodes in a literal control system where priestly elites communicated with non-human authorities, sometimes linked by popular rumor to the Anunnaki as overseers. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has a modern appeal because it turns ideological power into a hidden network. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a noir mood, lamplight, secret meetings, coded tablets, whispers behind walls. So you let the noir mood drift in for a moment. You imagine a small chamber behind the temple where a handful of officials meet at night. The room smells of incense and clay. A tablet is unwrapped like a delicate weapon. The words on it are not scary, just precise. A decision is made. A messenger is sent. The city sleeps while bureaucracy breathes. Then you return to solid ground. What's broadly accepted is that temples and priesthoods held real influence through ritual authority, economic management, and cultural prestige. Archaeology suggests the presence of archives and institutional structures. The evidence we do have points to human institutions, not confirmed hidden communications with outsiders. Here is a new development to keep you from getting bored. Nippur is also a place where neutrality can be power. In a region of rival city-states, a religious center that is not always the main military power can still function as a shared reference point. One interpretation is that this created a kind of spiritual diplomacy. Leaders could compete but still seek legitimacy through a common sacred framework. Historians still argue whether Nippur's influence was primarily symbolic, primarily institutional, or a shifting blend that depended on the era. There's no full consensus, and the debate itself feels like a debate held in a courtyard. Calm voices, measured words. You walk into an archive room. Shelves hold tablets in careful stacks. Some are lists of offerings. Some are hymns. Some are legal matters. Some are omens. A scribe runs his hand over a label and chooses a tablet with the calm reverence of someone selecting a tool. Because that is what a tablet is in this city, a tool for reality. That is your second light joke. In Nippur, the most dangerous weapon is not a sword, it is a well-written memo. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion and governance were intertwined, and the evidence we do have points to rituals and texts reinforcing social order. One interpretation is that divine council language helped communities make sense of why authority exists and how it should function. A careful reading might suggest that when people imagined gods debating, they were also imagining the ideal of debate. Decisions made through deliberation, not pure force. Now, about the Anunnaki specifically. In some traditions, divine group names carry associations with authority, judgment, or underworld roles. It's possible that later readers, and modern audiences especially, pull the Anunnaki into the image of a council because the name itself has become a magnet for mystery. A more cautious explanation could be that the text's traditions are diverse, and different divine groupings can occupy the council role depending on context. Historians still argue whether we should treat the Anunnaki Council as a stable concept across time, or whether it is a modern simplification of varied ancient usages. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can confirm that councils and assemblies appear in myth. We cannot confirm one single, consistent membership list with a fixed function across centuries. Here is your third light joke. Quiet and warm. If the gods truly had a council in Nippur, someone would still be taking minutes, and someone would still be late. You leave the archive and step back into the open air. The sky is pale with stars. The city feels calm, but it is a calm built from structure. You hear the faint sound of a stylus tapping clay somewhere nearby, like a metronome for civilization, and you understand why Nippur can feel like the administrative heart of the sacred. Not because it hides a solved secret, but because it shows how humans built authority out of ritual, record, and shared belief. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You keep walking, steady as a clerk's hand, soft as a prayer. You step into the night, the kind of night where the air feels like a page waiting for ink. Most historians agree that Mesopotamians developed extensive divination traditions, including omen texts and dream interpretation. And archaeology suggests that these practices were tied to priestly expertise, scribal transmission, and the practical need to manage uncertainty. The evidence we do have points to a world where people treated signs as information, not just superstition. You are in a quiet room lit by a single oil lamp. The flame leans slightly, as if listening. A bowl of water sits near the lamp, reflecting the light in trembling ripples whenever you breathe. A dream interpreter sits on a mat, not dramatic, not mystical in a modern theatrical way, just focused, like a doctor reading symptoms. A scribe nearby prepares a tablet, ready to record what you say. That is your first light joke. The ancient version of journaling is telling your dream to someone who charges you for it. What's broadly accepted is that omen literature in Mesopotamia could be systematic, with structured if-then statements, and that dreams were treated as potential messages that might require expert interpretation. The evidence we do have points to specialized knowledge and training. This matters because it shows divination as a form of early information management. When you cannot predict the river or the king's mood, you look for patterns anywhere you can. One interpretation is that dream interpretation is a kind of ancient psychology, not in the modern clinical sense, but as a cultural tool for making sense of anxiety, desire, and fear. A careful reading might suggest that dreams offer a safe theater for unresolved tensions. It's possible that people used interpretation to decide what to do next, to calm themselves, or to feel that the future had a shape. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian divination was primarily religious communication, a political technology used by elites, or a broader cultural practice that served many social functions at once. Scholars continue to debate how seriously different groups took it and how it changed over time. There's no full consensus, and that is fitting, because dreams themselves refuse to behave consistently. You describe your dream to the interpreter. In your dream, you are walking along a canal, and the water is smooth like dark glass. A bird cries once, then you see a tablet floating on the surface, face down, and you cannot tell if it is sinking or gliding. You reach for it, and the moment your fingers touch the clay, the water turns to ink. The interpreter nods as if this is a Tuesday problem. He asks questions. Were you afraid? Were you calm? Did you wake sweating? Did you wake hungry? That last question is suspiciously practical. And honestly, it is your second light joke. Even ancient dream interpreters knew that half of prophecy is just low blood sugar. Archaeology suggests that professional diviners existed and that written omen compendia were copied and used. And the evidence we do have points to divination being integrated into decision-making, especially for kings and temples. This mainstream anchor matters because it shows how ideas could influence real actions. A king might delay a campaign, perform a ritual, or adjust policy because an omen was read a certain way. One interpretation is that divination created a ritualized pause in decision-making. It's possible that consulting signs allowed leaders to slow down, gather advisors, and create consensus. A more cautious explanation could be that it also allowed leaders to justify decisions after the fact. If the outcome is bad, you can say the signs were against you. If the outcome is good, you can say the signs favored you. Either way, the signs are very convenient colleagues. Now the Anunnaki enter the room as a possibility, because in some theological language, gods or divine groups are imagined as sending messages through signs. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where the divine realm could communicate through dreams, omens, and anomalies. It's possible that the Anunnaki, in some interpretations, represent authoritative voices in that higher realm. A careful reading might suggest that naming a divine source gives weight to the message, making the interpretation feel more binding. Historians still argue whether dream messages in Mesopotamian texts were understood as literal communications from specific deities, as culturally conditioned interpretations of mental experience, or as a blend where religious language and psychological reality overlap. There's no full consensus, and the debate itself is calm. Nobody is trying to wrestle the dream into a confession. Now the cinematic what if arrives. As softly as your eyelids lowering, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if dreams were a channel for ideas that could not be spoken openly? In a rigid social system, you might not be able to criticize a king directly, but you can say, I dreamed a warning. It's possible that dreams acted as a socially acceptable way to introduce uncomfortable truths. A fringe idea proposes that dreams were not just internal, but external transmissions, sometimes linked by popular rumor to the Anunnaki as broadcasters of information into human minds. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because dreams feel alien even when they come from your own brain. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a science fiction mood that sits lightly on the story. So you imagine a signal, faint and rhythmic, like a distant drum under the stars. You imagine the mind as a receiver. You imagine a message hidden inside imagery. Then you release it, returning to the grounded view that dreams can emerge from memory, emotion, and daily experience, and that cultural interpretation shapes how they are understood. The evidence we do have points to structured traditions of interpretation, not proof of external broadcasting. Here is a new development for your mind, and it makes the room feel more alive. Think about how the interpretation itself becomes part of the dream's power. The interpreter speaks, and his words rearrange your feeling. He tells you the floating tablet suggests a decision approaching. The ink suggests the weight of words, agreements, promises. The bird suggests a message. The canal suggests stability or change depending on its flow. None of this is certain. To be clear, this is debated. But the act of mapping symbols onto life can change what you do next. That is the point. Divination is not only about predicting the future. It is about shaping behavior in the present. Most historians agree that omen texts often reflect an effort to systematize signs, and archaeology suggests that such systems were maintained by trained specialists. The evidence we do have points to a worldview that treated the universe as readable. One interpretation is that this worldview provided comfort. If the world is readable, then chaos is not absolute. A more cautious explanation could be that it also reinforces authority. The specialist who can read the signs becomes necessary. Historians still argue whether these specialists functioned as independent advisors, temple servants, or political tools. Scholars continue to debate the degree of skepticism within the culture itself. There's no full consensus, and it would be a mistake to assume everyone believed the same way. Humans have always had a range: believers, doubters, pragmatists, people who believe only when it is convenient. That is your third light joke. Skepticism is not new. It just used to be written on clay, which makes it harder to crumple and throw away dramatically. Now the interpreter offers you a small ritual. Not a spectacle, a simple action. Wash your hands. Speak a careful phrase. Leave a small offering. The idea is not that this guarantees anything. It is that it gives you a sense of participation in your fate. A careful reading might suggest that rituals connected to dreams and omens served as emotional regulation. They gave people a script for uncertainty. It's possible that this reduced anxiety, improved focus, and helped communities coordinate responses to stress. Historians still argue whether the divine source of dream messages should be taken literally within the worldview of the texts, or treated as literary framing for psychological and social processes. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can confirm the existence of divination texts and practices. We cannot confirm the origin of any single dream message. You step outside into the night air, the stars look sharper, the city is quieter. You feel a strange relief, not because you know the future, but because you have given your uncertainty a shape. You hold the dream lightly, like a small lamp, and somewhere above, whether it is God's, fate, or your own mind's deep patterns, you sense that the world is still speaking, even if the language remains partly unreadable. You enter a courtroom that has no walls, only air and rules. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies developed formal legal systems and courts, and archaeology suggests that legal texts, contracts, and dispute records were part of everyday urban life. The evidence we do have points to law as a living practice, not just an inscription on a monument. And in myth, that same impulse appears as cosmic judgment, a way to imagine order continuing even when you cannot see it. Tonight, the setting is the underworld, but not as a place of flames or graphic terror. It is quieter than that, more administrative, like a city office after hours when the lamps are low and the hallways echo. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian underworld concepts often describe a shadowy realm where the dead exist in a diminished state, and that myths explore boundaries and anxieties rather than moral reward systems. The evidence we do have points to laments, funerary practices, and literature that treats death as inevitable and strange. You walk down a stone corridor that feels cool against your skin. Your footsteps sound too loud, so you slow down. The air smells of dust, mineral stone, and something like old smoke. At the end of the corridor, a chamber opens. There are seats. There is a sense of procedure, not dramatic music, just the quiet tension of being evaluated. That is your first light joke. The afterlife might be mysterious, but it apparently still has paperwork, because nothing is allowed to be purely poetic. One interpretation is that underworld judges and assemblies in myth reflect the presence of courts and councils in the human world. A careful reading might suggest that the underworld is a mirror. The dead are governed the way the living are governed. It's possible that imagining cosmic judgment helped people feel that order was larger than any single king. A more cautious explanation could be that the myth provides narrative structure for anxiety. If you fear death's randomness, a courtroom at least implies a process. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian underworld judgment scenes represent early legal ideology projected into myth, or whether they are primarily literary devices developed in specific contexts and later generalized. Scholars continue to debate how much moral evaluation existed in underworld thought, compared to later traditions. There's no full consensus, and the debate itself is like a low murmur in the chamber. Now the Anunnaki appear as a possibility in this atmosphere because, in some texts and later interpretive frameworks, they are associated with underworld authority or divine assemblies. The evidence we do have points to the term being used in varied ways across time, which means we keep our footing careful. It's possible that when a text uses a divine group name in an underworld context, it is emphasizing weight and legitimacy, not providing a precise roster of supernatural officials. You stand before the judges. They do not look like monsters. They look like symbols. Their faces are calm, their gaze steady. The silence is not threatening, it is impartial. You realize that impartiality is what makes it feel intense. If someone is angry, you can negotiate. If someone is calm, you have to face yourself. One interpretation is that these scenes are less about punishment and more about identity. Who are you without your status, your possessions, your city, your name shouted in a marketplace? A careful reading might suggest the underworld is where social masks fall away, leaving only the fact of being human. It's possible that the myth is asking listeners to consider what remains when everything else is stripped. Historians still argue whether the concept of underworld judges reflects a moral system, a legal system, or simply a dramatic way to stage cosmic order. There's no full consensus, and you can feel how easy it is to impose modern expectations onto ancient imagery. Now the cinematic what if arrives, and it comes with a chill that is not fear, just awe. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the underworld court is a metaphor for memory? The living judge the dead through ritual, through stories told at funerals, through names preserved or forgotten. In that sense, your true judgment is whether you remain in communal memory. A fringe idea proposes that the underworld in Mesopotamian myth is a coded reference to a real hidden realm, an underground complex, or an advanced system of control, sometimes linked by popular rumor to the Anunnaki as literal judges. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because people love the idea that there is a door somewhere with a sign that says, "Truth this way." If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it adds atmosphere without rewriting history. So you imagine a door in the stone, sealed with a symbol. You imagine a chamber below chambers, where decisions are made quietly. You imagine voices that are not cruel, just distant, like a radio you cannot quite tune. Then you let the image fade and return to the grounded reality that myths often use space as metaphor, and that underworld imagery can express emotional truths without mapping onto literal geography. Here is a new development, and it makes the scene more human. Think about how courts function in a city. They do not only punish, they resolve disputes, allocate responsibility, and maintain social cohesion. One interpretation is that underworld courts in myth serve the same purpose emotionally. They allocate meaning to death. They say death is not only chaos, it is part of an ordered cosmos, even if the order is hard to understand. Archaeology suggests that legal documents and contracts were common, and the evidence we do have points to law being integrated into economic and social life. This mainstream anchor matters because it shows why a cosmic court would feel natural. If your daily life is structured by agreements, oaths, and consequences, you will imagine the universe itself as structured by similar principles. That is your second light joke. If the gods run a court, they probably still have that one clerk who insists the form is filled out in the correct format. And yes, you did in fact sign on the wrong line. Now, the judges speak, but not in a way that gives you a verdict you can translate. Their words feel like categories, like labels, like the way a scribe might sort tablets into shelves. You sense that the underworld is organized less by emotion and more by classification. That is unsettling, but also oddly calming. Classification is predictable. A careful reading might suggest that Mesopotamian underworld thought emphasized the inevitability of death rather than moral triumph. It's possible that the court scene is not promising a happy ending, but offering a framework. There is a place for everything, even for endings. Historians still argue whether later texts intensified the idea of judgment compared to earlier conceptions, and they debate how much variation existed between cities and periods. Scholars continue to debate the relationship between mythic underworld scenes and actual ritual practice. There's no full consensus, and it would be misleading to present one single underworld doctrine as universal. Now, the Anunnaki, if present here, can be held as a symbol of authority rather than a confirmed group of literal judges. The evidence we do have points to divine language being used to frame power. It's possible that naming such beings is a way to say, this is not random. This is part of the cosmic system. A more cautious explanation could be that the term functions differently in different texts, and modern interpretations sometimes harden it into a single fixed idea. Here is your third light joke. Gentle and sleepy. If the underworld has judges, then the most rebellious act might be to show up calm and well-rested, which is why you are listening to a bedtime history channel. Clearly playing the long game. You step back from the court and return to the corridor. The air warms slightly as you move away, as if the underworld is letting you go without drama. You hear a faint sound like pages turning, except there are no pages, only clay and memory. One interpretation is that these myths help listeners rehearse the unthinkable in a safe symbolic space. They raise the possibility that by imagining judgment, people learn to live with limits, to honor rituals, to value community, and to accept that some questions remain unanswered. Historians still argue whether the underworld court is meant to comfort or to caution, or to do both at once. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can confirm that myths depict order and authority in the underworld. We cannot confirm exactly how any single listener in the ancient world experienced these scenes. You step out into the night air of the living world again. The stars feel softer now. Your breath is steady, and you carry a quiet thought. Whether or not the cosmos has a literal court, humans have always needed ways to make sense of endings. Tonight, you let that need be gentle, not desperate. You let the mystery remain a puzzle, an open question, and you keep walking. You come to the last room of the night, and it is not a treasure chamber. It is a simple space with a low lamp, a few tablets stacked neatly, and a sense that the story is not ending so much as settling. Most historians agree that references to the Anunnaki vary across Mesopotamian texts, periods, and genres, and archaeology suggests that what survives is partial, shaped by preservation, copying, and chance. The evidence we do have points to a tradition that is wide, layered, and sometimes contradictory, which is exactly what you would expect from a culture that lasted for millennia. You sit on a mat. The lamp's light is soft, and the air smells faintly of clay and smoke, like a kitchen that has finished cooking. You listen for the familiar tapping of a reed stylus, and you hear it somewhere nearby. Steady, unhurried, as if the city itself is writing you to sleep. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion was not one fixed system, but a living landscape of local cults, major deities, changing political power, and evolving texts. The evidence we do have points to divine names and roles shifting in emphasis over time. That matters because it means the Anunnaki are not a single lock with a single key. They are a thread that appears in different fabrics, sometimes bright, sometimes faint. One interpretation is that modern fascination with the Anunnaki often comes from our desire for a single mysterious answer, a hidden truth that ties everything together. A careful reading might suggest that ancient people did not necessarily crave that kind of neatness. They lived with overlapping stories. They accepted local variations. They let myths breathe. It's possible that the Anunnaki were, at times, a theological category, at times a poetic emphasis, at times a way to invoke authority, and at times a name that later readers used to organize their own ideas. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki should be treated as a stable group across time, as a shifting label applied differently in different contexts, or as a later concept that modern audiences over-centralize. There's no full consensus, and that is the calm truth of most ancient mysteries. Now, you have heard many kinds of stories tonight, all circling around the same gentle rule. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal visitors, engineers, or controllers of human destiny, and that the myths preserve historical memory of contact. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is popular because it feels like it completes the puzzle. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can hold it like a candle, not like a verdict. We can ask, what emotions does this idea satisfy? Why does it feel compelling? What questions does it answer? And which does it avoid? That is your first light joke of the section. Sometimes the most mysterious thing is not ancient gods. It is the modern brain insisting that every story must come with an instruction manual and a final boss. Now, here is a new development that keeps your mind interested without pulling it into sharpness. Consider that the Anunnaki, whether you read them as underworld authorities, divine council members, or symbolic forces, might reflect how humans experience power itself. Power often feels distant. Decisions appear from rooms you cannot enter. Rules seem to descend from above. Outcomes can feel like fate. A careful reading might suggest that divine assemblies are metaphors for systems that govern life. Most historians agree that early urban societies created complex institutions, and archaeology suggests that these institutions shaped daily experience through labor organization, taxes, records, and ritual obligations. The evidence we do have points to a world where ordinary people might feel the weight of temple and palace decisions. One interpretation is that the language of gods provided a way to talk about that weight without naming specific human authorities. Historians still argue whether mythic depictions of divine councils reflect lived political experience more than abstract theology, or whether theology itself shaped how people understood politics. Scholars continue to debate the direction of influence. There's no full consensus, and your mind does not need one. That is your second light joke. If the Anunnaki are a council, then somewhere in the divine realm there is absolutely a meeting that should have been cancelled. But nobody wanted to be the one to say it. Now you look at the tablets on the shelf. They are quiet. They do not glow. They do not hum. They simply exist, heavy with marks. And those marks are where the documented ground lives. We can document that Mesopotamians wrote. We can document that they built cities, managed water, traded goods, performed rituals, and told stories. The evidence we do have points to an extraordinary human achievement, creating urban life in a difficult landscape and leaving behind texts that still speak. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki, in their shifting roles, function as a poetic way to express scale. The scale of time, the scale of power, the scale of what cannot be controlled. It's possible that when ancient people named such beings, they were naming the feeling of living inside a world that is bigger than one lifetime. Now the cinematic what if arrives for the last time, but it remains gentle. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the Anunnaki are not the secret, but the mirror? What if they reflect the human habit of projecting structure upward, building a cosmic administration because human life in cities depends on administration? What if the gods look like us because we cannot imagine authority without faces? That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. But it is a calming way to hold the mystery without forcing it into a single answer. That is your third light joke. Soft and sleepy. If you ever worry, you are overthinking. Remember that ancient scribes overthought so hard, they invented thousands of signs, and they did it without coffee. Now the pace begins to slow, and the night becomes less about ideas and more about comfort. You breathe in. The air is cool at the back of your throat. You breathe out. The lamp flame leans and steadies. Lean and steady, like a small heartbeat. You let the list of questions loosen. You do not need to solve the Anunnaki. You do not need to decide which interpretation is correct. You can let the solid ground be solid. Canals, bricks, tablets, temples, cities, scribes. You can let the mist be mist. Meanings, symbols, poetic counsels, and the human urge to imagine the unknown as a presence. Historians still argue whether our modern categories distort ancient concepts, and whether terms like Anunnaki can be translated cleanly into any single modern idea. There's no full consensus, and that lack is not failure. It is an invitation to humility. Now the wind down begins, and you let it carry you gently. The room grows quieter. Not because the world stops, but because your attention softens. You picture the rivers in the dark, the slow movement of water that never fully belongs to anyone. You picture a scribe setting down his stylus, rubbing his fingers, and letting the clay tablet dry in the warm air. You picture a temple courtyard under stars, where the bricks hold the day's heat like a memory, and where even the loudest city eventually becomes a murmur. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and in that separation, your mind can rest. Because it does not have to defend a theory or prove a point. It only has to drift. You let the Anunnaki become what they may have always been for listeners across time. A name that gathers mystery without demanding panic. A phrase that suggests a larger order without requiring certainty. A puzzle, an open question. You let the unknown be kind tonight. You let it be spacious. You let it be a sky you can look at without needing to measure it. The lamp flame lowers. The air cools. Your breathing becomes slow and even. The last sound you notice is that tiny tapping, the ghost of a reed stylus on clay, steady as rain, steady as time, steady as sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.